From the scene of horrific crimes to one of the most extreme environments on Earth, all the way to a woman who lived with a corpse. Here is part 2 of the top 10 families that chose to stay in unsettling places. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have the roommate. Linda Chase is a woman who lived quite an isolated life and didn't really see or speak to many people, aside from her longtime friend and roommate Charles Ziegler. In 2010, Charles, who was in his 60s, ended up passing away from natural causes. Definitely a sad situation, but as is the circle of life, but rather than calling the proper people after Charles' death, Linda did nothing. Well, she put him in a chair and kept him there for the next 18 months. Linda decided she wanted to live with a corpse. Apparently she enjoyed the company and would speak to his remains while she watched NASCAR. In the end, Linda was also cashing his social security checks, which is both suspicious and fraud, and I believe that's actually how she was found out and caught. She swears that she didn't keep the body just for the checks, but rather because she didn't want to be alone, and while that is terribly sad, the jury is still out on that one. In our number 9 spot today, we have San Pedro. Okay, if you haven't heard of the San Pedro prison in Bolivia, do I have a story for you. This prison was made famous when a British inmate began giving tours of the prison to tourists in the early 2000s, which sounds kind of insane, but this prison is unlike any other that I've ever heard of. This prison is essentially run by the inmates and it functions like its own little society. It's absolutely wild. It's more like a hotel than what many would consider a traditional jail. Inmates actually have to purchase their own cell to which they get a key, and there are like nicer 5-star cells for the rich, and sometimes they even renovate them to make them nicer, but there are also smaller, more crammed cells that house more than a couple inmates. So like some cells go for $30,000 while others are just a couple hundred. So while this all may seem like a lax, fun sort of monopoly prison system, there are actually some major flaws with deadly consequences. The city in which San Pedro is built, La Paz, sits at about 3,600 meters above sea level. It's one of the highest cities in the world, and this means that at night the temperature drops rapidly, and if you're left without a cell, you might just die of exposure, as have many prisoners throughout the years. Along with the cost of a cell itself, inmates also have to pay for food, clothing, and medicine, so they need to have jobs within the prison to pay for all of this. You might be sitting there wondering what this all has to do with families that chose to stay in unsettling places, and really it's because at San Pedro, the government allows prisoners' wives and children to live with the inmates. I really did just say that. The children head off to school in the morning and return at night, and it is said that this is done so that the inmates don't lose contact with their families, and so that it can aid in their rehabilitation. The wives and children who reside at the prison are said to be treated with the utmost respect and are kept safe by all inmates, but despite that, it's of course an extremely controversial topic. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Danakil Depression. The Danakil Depression is a part of the Afar Triangle in Ethiopia, and it is a geological depression that came about as a result of Africa and Asia moving apart. The divergence of 3 tectonic plates caused rifting and volcanic activity. This place is the hottest on Earth in terms of average year-round temperatures, and it is also one of the lowest places on Earth at 100 meters below sea level. There are active volcanoes in the area, there are salt springs, sulfur springs, and it only gets about 4 to 8 inches of rain every year. What I'm saying is that this place is stunning, and it has an incredibly rich geological history, but it isn't very hospitable. Despite that, there are people who call this place home. The Afar people have called this area home for many years, and of course that poses the question of how? Well, the biggest industry in the Danakil Depression is salt, and many of the people who live here will mine salt with their hands and then take a 2-day camel journey into the next town to sell it. The people who live here also have to deal with an average temperature of 35 degrees Celsius, but sometimes it gets as hot as 50 degrees Celsius. Somehow they have overcome the odds and the obstacles and managed to thrive in this extreme environment, and it is said that this was made possible over the centuries by their ability to adapt to need less food and water than other humans. Honestly, it's one of the most remarkable things I've ever heard. And on number 7 spot today, we have the Ramsey Home. Okay, what would you say if someone told you that they bought the home where a horrific and one of the most prolific crimes of all time happened? And then what if I told you that they went to sell it years later but decided against it because they just loved the home so much? I mean, I get it, but I don't. You know? This is what happened when Timothy and Carol Schuller-Milner bought the Jean Benet Ramsey home in 2004 after it had sat vacant since the terrible crime happened in 1996. The 7,000 square foot home was built in 1926, and after their 2004 purchase, the couple tried listing and selling the home at a price point of $2.3 million in 2008, 2009, and again in 2011, and once again in 2014 at a lower price of $1.95 million, but surprisingly, no one wants to buy it. I wonder why. Now the home is unavailable for purchase, but not because it was snatched up by someone, but because Carol and Timothy turned down all the offers because they simply love the house so much. In our number 6 spot today, we have La Rinconada. This town is located near the Peruvian Andes, very close to a gold mine, and is actually the highest permanent settlement in the world at 5,100 meters above sea level. Between 2001 and 2009, the population of this town increased greatly because the price of gold rose 235% during that time. Because of the elevation, the town has an alpine tundra climate and an average temperature of around 1 degree Celsius. The city has no running water or sewage, and the population of people who live here are working themselves to the bone in extremely dangerous mercury-filled mines. They're also working under some pretty horrible conditions where they work 25 days of the month for no pay at all, and then for 5 days of the month they can work for themselves and they are allowed to take as much ore as they can carry on their shoulders, but there is no guarantee that the ore will have any gold in it, and this is a terrible system, and it's why many of the town's residents live in extreme poverty. The town is a 6-hour bus ride from the nearest city on unpaved roads, and there isn't really a regular bus schedule, which makes it very difficult to get to. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Yukon Wilderness. Suzanne Crocker and her husband Gerard Parson packed up their lives along with their 3 children and set off to live for 9 months in a remote cabin in the Yukon Territory here in Canada. They lived with no running water, no electricity, no internet, and not even clocks or watches. They wanted to unplug in the most dramatic way possible. Suzanne said, quote, "To get the freedom of time again, we had to free ourselves from the structure of time and see what would happen." They actually made a film about this adventure called All the Time in the World, and it begins by showing their arrival to the cabin where they have to work for days in order to transport all their food. They have to haul it up a hill to the cabin, and then they have to build a food shed on stilts to prevent bears from reaching it. When the temperatures plunged to minus 50 degrees Celsius and the nearby river froze solid, they described it as liberating, being able to skate, ski, and snowshoe freely. The coldest days they had a bit of cabin fever, but in the film, one of the children, Kate, makes a very beautiful point as to why, when the 8-year-old explains that, quote, "Inside is our storage place, but outside is actually our home." Half the days were spent preparing food, as quite literally everything needed to be made from scratch, of course, and all of this was only possible because both Suzanne and Gerard clearly had extensive knowledge of life in the wild. While this was certainly not an easy mission, there are definitely more unsettling places on this list, and as it turns out, this 9-month-long adventure turned out quite beautifully. In our number 4 spot today, we have Volcanic Island. This is one that is very different from the others on this list, but it was just so incredibly interesting we have to talk about it. Back in 1965, Mano Tatau and 5 of his friends were studying at a boarding school in Tonga when they decided to do something quite rebellious, and that was to steal a traditional whaling boat and set off for Fiji. There are of course several flaws with this plan, but boys are boys, and they stole this engineless boat that had no map or compass, despite their destination being about 500 miles away. On the first night of this trip, a terrible storm ripped off the sails from the mast and tore off the boat's rudder, and for the next week the ship drifted aimlessly until the teens were able to struggle ashore to a volcanic island that they were able to spot. They were on the island of Ada and now had to learn how to survive. While many would expect some sort of Lord of the Flies situation, it was anything but that. The boys worked together to keep each other and themselves alive. Until they could build a fire, they ate raw fish. They would drink the blood and eggs of seabirds to keep their thirst quenched, and at one point they were able to find a clay pot, a machete, and some chickens that were left over from a small Tongan community that had lived here before. I could go on about this story forever, but in the end the boys lived quite harmoniously for 15 months while they were stranded on this island before they were rescued and brought back home, much to the astonishment of their families who had been grieving them for the last year. Despite how long it's been, many of the boys, who are of course now now men, remain friends and sometimes even sail together. In our number 3 spot today we have the Versace Mansion. This place is an American property that was built in 1930 and is well known for being owned by Italian fashion designer Gianni Versace, as well as the place where Andrew Cunanan took Gianni's life. This 19,000 square foot Miami Beach home was bought by Gianni for $2.95 million in 1992, and in 1993 he also bought the adjoining Revere Hotel for $3.7 million, which he tore down to make the pool and garden area for his home. On July 15, 1997, Gianni was sadly shot by Andrew at the front of his home, and to this day, no one really knows why. Of course, when a tragedy occurs in a home like this one, it isn't exactly easy to sell after. In 2000, however, that all changed when Peter Lofton purchased the home for $19 million. Instead of using it for his own personal enjoyment, he decided to use the property as a boutique hotel, restaurant, and luxury event space. After that, in 2003, the mansion was bought by VM South Beach LLC for $41.5 million, and since then they have been using it as a luxury hotel with 10 unique suites. So yeah, not just one family is staying here, just a bunch of different rich ones are. In our number 2 spot today we have Centralia, Pennsylvania. This is a door to hell that is located in Pennsylvania underneath the cracked asphalt of one of the town's streets. Under these streets is an underground coal mine fire that was first set ablaze in 1962, and it just may continue burning for another couple hundred years, or maybe forever if it really is the entrance to hell. It is unknown exactly how the fire was first started, which is the topic of many arguments, but it quickly burned through all of the old networks of shafts and tunnels. After the fire started, sinkholes began to appear all over, and steam plumes, which were full of lethal amounts of carbon monoxide, began to rise from the ground. People started to compare what was going on underneath the city to what hell must be like, thus the door to hell name. Once 1984 rolled around, the government began urging people to leave the city and even claimed to help with the relocating costs, but as of 2013 there were 8 residents who refused to leave, and they ended up settling a lawsuit that included a $349,500 settlement and the right to reside in the town until the end of their lives. In our number 1 spot today we have the Dahmer Home. Jeffrey Dahmer is of course one of the most terrifying and prolific serial killers ever, which is exactly why it doesn't come as a surprise that his home, the one where some of his very first crimes were carried out, was a bit of a tough sell. Yeah, turns out most people don't want it. How strange. Pedro was going to use the property to convert it into a vegan restaurant, but because of zoning issues, that never happened, so they needed to look for someone else to purchase the property instead, and that ended up being Chris Butler, the rock musician from Waitresses. According to Chris, when he first viewed the home, he had no idea the dark history behind it. He was really intrigued in it because it is surrounded by woods, and as a rock musician, looking for somewhere you can make as much noise as you want without bothering anybody is ideal, but when you think of a serial killer owning it prior, that thought immediately gives you the shivers. In the end, he says he went with the house because he really liked it, and it's not like it's the house's fault for the atrocities Jeffrey committed, which, I mean, is fair. He also doesn't believe in ghosts, so he doesn't worry on that front. According to him, the only thing he really worries about in the home is all the people stopping by who want a tour like they're entitled to it. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you all next time. Bye!